talk to any die-hard fighting game fan about what their favorite fighting game is, then chances are it'll be Capcom's Street Fighter III Third Strike. Loved by the FGC for its gorgeous visuals, mechanically heavy gameplay, banger soundtrack, and more, Third Strike is a classic 2D fighting game with an undeniable impact. But how did we get here? Surely, it wasn't as easy as Capcom making a fighting game to capitalize on the popularity of Street Fighter II, releasing it in the arcades, and then soaking up all the profits, right? Even though Street Fighter II, and to some extent Street Fighter Alpha, received many updates and re-releases over time, Street Fighter III only has 3 entries. I think it'd be interesting to cover all of them, the circumstances that led up to the creation of Street Fighter III in the first place, and the reception from fans once the game was finally released in the arcades. A lot of my info comes from not only looking for old magazines from the 90s that covered the game, but also the Polygon article, Street Fighter III and Oral History, so if you want to learn more about Street Fighter III, definitely check it out. This video will be split up into multiple parts to help you all follow along in chronological order. Some parts will be short, and some parts will be long, and trust me, there will be a lot of Street Fighter III information in this video, so I do apologize if it gets a bit overwhelming. Without further ado, let's dive into the inception of the Street Fighter III sub-series titled Street Fighter III New Generation. To be honest, Street Fighter III was doomed from the very beginning. Don't believe me? Then ask Chris Kramer, former Street Fighter public relations representative at Capcom USA. He mentions how in the mid to late 90s, home console sales of Street Fighter games weren't great, and American arcades were just dying in general. Not just Kramer, but other Capcom staff like artist Akira Yasuda mentioned how 3D fighting games like Tekken and Virtua Fighter were the next big thing for their 3D based graphics. Immediately, Capcom had an important decision to make. Ditch the concept of having Street Fighter be a 2D fighting game and go full 3D, or stay true to their roots and use sprite-based artwork for the game. It was a tough decision, but Capcom decided to stick with what they knew best. Looking back, this was absolutely the right decision, but at the time, Capcom suffered for it. Heavily. Fighting game commentator James Chen recalled that a lot of people were disappointed that it was sprite-based because 3D was such a fad at the time. But we're getting way ahead of ourselves here, so let's take it way back. Way back. The King of Dragons director Tadashi Samamoto wanted to make an original fighting game for Capcom which had nothing to do with Street Fighter. But internal testing showed the game was bland and lacked personality, so Capcom decided to put Ryu into the game, and then over time, decided to turn it into a Street Fighter game, which completely went against Samamoto's original idea. This game was to be called New Generation, as it was something that audiences had never seen before. With the inclusion of Ryu in the game, Capcom officially commenced development on Street Fighter III in 1994. With the game now in active development, it should have been a breeze, right? Capcom had plenty of experience in creating fighting games, and this was the brand new mainline numbered entry into the Street Fighter series, so it should have been a slam dunk. Put it this way, Street Fighter III started development in 1994, but it released in 1997, which was an awfully slow process for Capcom fighting games at the time. One of the planners on the game, Shinichiro Obata, explains how development went in this lengthy passage. To explain what happened, there was a big structural change at Capcom at the time. Prior to that point, the company didn't have a system where a different producer led each project. Okamoto had been producing pretty much every game Capcom released, but then Capcom solicited the services of a consulting company that recommended Capcom introduce a producer system in order to streamline the flow of development. So when that change happened, the people who had been the lead game designers or directors ended up becoming the producers of Capcom's projects. In the case of Street Fighter III, it was originally spearheaded by someone who worked on it as a lead designer or director, and then he became the producer. But the thing is, a lot of these people had only done game design, so they didn't know how to produce games. And when he became the producer, Capcom had to find someone to take his place as the lead designer, and they assigned that job to someone who was pretty junior at the time. The thing about Street Fighter 3's team was that, surprisingly, even though it was Capcom, which was known for fighting games, 70% to 80% of the team members had no experience making fighting games. Why that was the case, I honestly have no idea, but there were people on the team who were quite inexperienced. I think more than half of them, mainly the planners and programmers, weren't really familiar with fighting games at all. By this point, a lot of the old guard, the people who had worked on fighting games beforehand, like Street Fighter 2 co-planner Akira Nishitani, had already left the company. And even amongst those of the older Street Fighter games who were still around at Capcom at the time, most of them were not on the Street Fighter 3 team. They had all the know-how, but they were all on the Street Fighter Alpha team, and the Street Fighter Alpha team and the Street Fighter 3 team never really shared much information with each other. So by the time I came around, the team didn't really have a very clear concept of what to do with the game. They had created a lot of animation patterns, and they wanted the hits to feel like they had a real heft behind them, to make it look cool when you took damage. But the problem was that the team had no idea what kind of mechanics should go into the game in order to make it an interesting fighting game. There was no plan for that, and there weren't enough moves for each character. So I ended up joining the team when the game was in that kind of state. It's a lot, I know, but it perfectly illustrates how a lack of experience and managerial change can easily leave an impact on a game's development in an instant. So far, we have an inexperienced team who aren't familiar with making fighting games, a complete internal shift at Capcom, and most of the Street Fighter 2 developers were no longer at Capcom and couldn't be consulted for advice. However, this wasn't known to the public yet, and during a meeting in Tokyo on March 27, 1996, Capcom announced that Street Fighter 3 was indeed a reality. Right away, I want you to think of a classic Street Fighter character in your head. If you thought of someone like Ryu, Ken, Guile, Chun-Li, Zangief, Dhalsim, Blanka, etc., you thought the same as everyone back in the 90s, because when the public saw that Street Fighter 3 would only have Ryu and Ken, they instantly turned on the game for not including more fan favorites. Even Capcom staff themselves did not like this idea, as a freaky character like Oro looked a little too weird for something like Street Fighter. After a lengthy and strenuous development cycle that cost Capcom $8 million, the game was a flop. While Street Fighter 3 New Generation was fun to play and had impressive graphics, games like Tekken 3 and Virtua Fighter 3 proved to be more popular for their 3D graphics, and as a result, Street Fighter 3 unfortunately sold horribly. The initial version of Street Fighter 3 saw shockingly low sales. I remember seeing the numbers and just being really surprised at how the game just wasn't selling. It felt like we created the worst selling game ever at Capcom. It felt awful. Before Street Fighter and Final Fight, 3,000 units of an arcade game was considered a success. When Final Fight came out, that sold 30,000 units, and then after that, Street Fighter 2 came out and sold 50,000 units. So the standard had gone up from selling thousands of units to selling tens of thousands of units. And Street Fighter 3 sold 1,000. That's terrible, right? I mean, it was terrible because look at how much we had invested into the game's development. However, there are lots of games that don't sell well, but garner a strong cult following from people who love the game and never stop playing it. While Street Fighter 3 is one of those games nowadays, it reached nowhere near this level of acceptance in the 90s. Reviews from outlets like Next Generation and GamePro were positive, but even though critics liked the game a lot, it still couldn't make it a success for Capcom. Even though New Generation was a failure sales-wise, Capcom released an update titled Street Fighter 3 Second Impact in arcades in late 1997, less than a year after the original release. In terms of developer quotes and interviews, we've reached a dry spell, as due to how unpopular Street Fighter 3 was at launch, there are little to no developer comments on Second Impact we can easily find, which is unfortunate. But what changed about the game? What did it introduce? One of the ways for fighting game fans to learn about Second Impact back in the day was to read the Sega Saturn magazine, specifically page 93 of issue 25. Here, they would learn that Capcom has listened to player criticism and pushed the game to its limits by introducing newcomers Urien and Hugo, EX moves which add some extra strategy in battle by promoting different ways to use meter, an ability to taunt the enemy, and remade frames of animation. Other gameplay inclusions included being able to tech throws, some characters gaining new moves, changes in frame data, and the length of the super meter being changed. Even though Capcom put genuine care, love, hard work, and attention into Second Impact, it once again failed to resonate with audiences. Releasing another Street Fighter game to poor sales and unimpressive fan reception must have dealt a blow to the development team at Capcom. Look, don't get me wrong, Street Fighter 3 did have some fans who played and supported the game, but these were the really die-hard fighting game fans who lived and breathed arcade culture and fell in love with Street Fighter 3's parry mechanic and highly sophisticated animation style. Outlets like IGN, CNET, and GamePro all stated that Second Impact was strictly for the hardcore fighting game audience, and that casuals should play something else like Street Fighter Alpha 3. Speaking of which, they make a good point. Why would I play Street Fighter 3 over Alpha? I'm sure many casual fighting game fans thought this in the arcades. What also didn't help was that unlike other Capcom fighting games like Street Fighter 2, Street Fighter Alpha, Marvel vs. Capcom, etc., is that Street Fighter 3 had no home console version, so if you wanted to play it, you had to go to the arcade. This could be for a myriad of reasons, but the main one is that the game contained so many detailed animations and it ran on Capcom's CPS3 arcade board that it was near impossible to port it to home consoles in an arcade-accurate manner. But that didn't stop Capcom from trying. Released in 1999 exclusively for the Dreamcast, Street Fighter 3 Double Impact was a home conversion of not only Second Impact, but also New Generation. 2 whole years had passed since the release of these games in the arcade, and it was only now that they finally made their way onto the home console market. Critically, it did pretty well, earning around a 7.5 to 8 out of 10 on average from reviewers, but even they knew that the fans weren't having it, with IGN stating, "This game is not going to push 1 million Dreamcast systems on the public, not by a long shot." While the game is good value in theory for providing 2 games on the one disc, the problem for Capcom was that a vast majority of people just didn't want to play it, and without providing any new substantial content, was it really worth buying Street Fighter 3 Double Impact at full price? Casual players weren't going to purchase Double Impact after having spent the last 2 years playing it in the arcades. Okay, let's do another recap. After the failure of New Generation, Capcom put out Second Impact, which also flopped. Fast forward 2 years later, and a home port finally released on the Dreamcast, but the reception is still the same, and it does nothing to revitalize the Street Fighter brand. Capcom invested lots of time, money, and manpower into these games, and they both flopped. Released in May of 1999, the final installment of the Street Fighter 3 series titled Third Strike aimed to be the most complete version of the game yet, with more brand new content, including the return of Chun-Li, as well as 4 brand new characters, Makoto, Q, 12, and Remy. According to a developer interview from a month before release, Capcom staff revealed that Third Strike had a 1.5 years of development time, and this explains how they were able to incorporate 4 new characters into the game. As for who made it exactly, it was the Second Impact team, along with some other staff members at Capcom who were brought on to assist with development. A remarkable shift in the game's presentation concerns its soundtrack, specifically the main theme and character select music. While New Generation and Second Impact mostly focused on drum and bass for their soundtracks, with some elements of jazz, house, techno, and hip-hop, Third Strike went all in on the street aesthetic for its presentation. Composed by Hideki Okugawa with Canadian rapper Infinite, the music is one of the most important factors in Third Strike's status as a beloved classic fighting game. According to Infinite in a 2020 interview, Capcom came to Canada looking for their guy. They did an audition and everybody was there. When I say everybody, I mean everybody. The beat they put on for you to rap on, we did not know what it was going to be. You're not allowed in there when someone is auditioning, so when it's your turn, they call you into the room and you see them sitting at their table. You're on the stage, they're sitting there with their pen. This was an opportunity, and I wasn't going to let that pass. I rapped on that and I stayed on that. I think it was the next day or later that day, they contacted us and they said, "We want to use you guys." Third Strike is beloved nowadays, but when it came to how it was received back in 1999, no one cared. Like, it was just the same thing again. Chun-Li was clearly overpowered, and a lot of people were really mad about that. You could just hit back heavy punch all day and it just killed half the characters in the game, and no one really cared. So a lot of people have this assumption that Street Fighter 3 Third Strike came out and just resurrected it. Nowadays, everyone talks about it as this gold standard, but honestly, during that time, no one really batted an eye on it. It was not that popular of a game in the arcades. To American arcade goers, Street Fighter 3 Third Strike was yet another revision of an already existing game instead of something brand new, so there wasn't that much reason to spend money on it. I mean, was it really that different from the last one? Over in Japan, however, the game had a lengthy location test that spanned a month, and countless die-hard Second Impact fans showed up time and time again to play Third Strike before launch. Unlike the development of New Generation, Third Strike's development was steady and quick, with main planner Hidetoshi Ishizawa stating, "Yeah, when you compare the version of the game at the beginning of the location test and what we ended up with, it's like two entirely different games." And added onto that was, and 70% of those changes were made in the last 3 days. It's crazy. It almost feels like the entire game was made in 1 week, by text and UI creator Haruo Murata. A scrapped feature of Third Strike was the ability to use a bomb. Yes, you heard that right. Bombs were planned to be part of the combat system. The reason for this, according to Ishizawa, is because parrying was seen as the ultimate defensive technique, so the developers wanted something that could be the ultimate offensive technique. A once per round bomb attack was planned where everything would get destroyed, but it never made its way into the final game, mainly due to how out of left field it would be for a Street Fighter game. Another thing that didn't make it into the final version of Street Fighter 3 was Makoto in Second Impact. Ishizawa once again stated, "We actually finished Makoto's design during Second Impact's development, but for various reasons we ran out of time to include her there, and resolved to include her next time. And so we did." Hell, even Abigail from Final Fight was considered for Third Strike, before eventually joining the Street Fighter series in Street Fighter V. Third Strike's development consisted of the staff trying to incorporate radical new ideas into the series, and while gameplay mechanics like the bombs weren't included, weirdo characters like Q and 12 accomplished Capcom's goal. With that all said and done, Street Fighter 3, while being a sales failure at the time, slowly but surely grew in popularity as time went on. It's not far-fetched to say that Third Strike was ahead of its time, as the game is consistently played today in both casual and competitive settings. Street Fighter 3 was so radically different from what came before it, so market alienation was bound to happen, but I don't think Capcom could have predicted in the 90s that their fledgling arcade game would be resurrected on a global level many, many years later. It's a die-hard fighting game fan's heaven, with its technical gameplay, high execution requirements, varied character roster, stylish visuals, and fantastic soundtrack. The series is still going strong today, but Street Fighter 3 represents a darker period of the series' history, when it was waning in popularity with the general consumer. Looking back at Street Fighter 3 in retrospect provides a unique insight into Capcom's failures, successes, and lessons learned at the time in the fighting game world, and you can see how it influenced their later games. There will never be another Street Fighter 3.